Hi, everybody. I'm Amy O'Hara, the president of the Association of Public Data Users, or AppDo, and I want to welcome you here today for what I'm sure will be a really interesting and thought-provoking discussion about AI. And we hope to cover the opportunities and the perils of AI in the future of public data. And I'm delighted to be joined by Nathan Sanders, the author of Rewiring Democracy. He's a data scientist who's focused on policy making it more participatory, and his research has spanned machine learning, astrophysics, public health, environmental justice, and more. He has served in fellowships at the Massachusetts Legislature and at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. Nathan, you know that I've seen you speak and have read the book, but I'd love for you to share with our audience a brief version of what you and Bruce wrote about.
Sure, happy to. Amy, it's just so great to be in discussion with you and to join the whole group here. Thank you for having me and taking some time to think about what we've been thinking about, which are all the ways that AI is transforming democracy. That's really the premise of our book, which I should hold up here, Rewiring Democracy, written with my co-author Bruce Schneier here at Harvard at the Kennedy School and for me at the Berkman Klein Center. The premise of our book is really that AI is already reshaping democracy. The cat is out of the bag on that. There's so many examples that we catalog in our book showing impacts on democracy around the world. But, and this is the key point of our book, but we are not powerless to steer the future of how AI impacts democracy. And that's what we try and unpack in the book and try and show what different routes forward may be. In terms of how AI is already impacting democracy, we do a very broad survey across the executive, judicial, legislative branches, as well as what it means to be a citizen and to do politics. We talk about examples like what's happening in Japan right now, where a new party called Team Mirai that's focused on digital democracy is reimagining how voters engage with candidates. They have used AI not just as an avatar that kind of, has a cartoonish way of speaking on behalf of the candidate, but actually interviews individual constituents, collects their feedback on specific policy positions, and helps a candidate respond to their voters by modifying their policy platform in a way that really directly shows people what impact they're having on how the candidates that they're talking to are thinking. We talk about applications in executive administration. When we finalized the text of the book, we were just transitioning into this world where the second Trump administration was putting DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, in place, and they were claiming to take an AI first policy to reimagining how the executive branch operates. And so we wrote a lot about in the book what the risks are of that kind of AI first approach, and ultimately what it means in terms of consolidating power in the executive and giving a sole individual at the top of a bureaucracy more control to dictate how their policies are implemented throughout a very large set of agencies. We wrote about how court systems around the world are being transformed by AI. The example in Brazil, where they historically have had a very large backlog of cases that have clogged up the court system, and they've had a program for many years now of integrating predictive machine learning technologies to try and optimize the flow of cases to their court system, and how that's had real and in some ways really positive impacts on helping them beat down that backlog and be more efficient in processing cases on behalf of litigants. We talk about examples of legislatures using AI to synthesize and receive constituent feedback and be more responsive to it. I'm involved in one of those projects here in Massachusetts, a project called the Massachusetts Platform for Legislative Engagement, MAPLE, which you can see at mapletestimony.org. We are focused on helping people have their voice heard in the legislature to submit written testimony on bills. And we find AI to be a really useful tool for enabling that. We use it to transcribe oral hearings that happen in the State House and provide a searchable database of that testimony. We use it to summarize bills so that people have a more accessible way to understand the legalese of what legislators are debating. And we talk about groups that are reimagining what citizenship looks like, powered by AI, using AI to give journalists and residents more insight into and oversight over what's happening in government. We talk about the example of Cal Matters, the nonprofit news agency in California, which has used AI to create an AI tip sheet, using it to analyze information from public records, including financial disclosures, expense reports, voting histories, lobbying disclosure reports, and using that to give journalists tips about surprising changes, let's say in voting positions, that may be correlated with, for example, a donation that's been received, and to invite journalists to follow up on that and do the human reporting necessary to add context and help voters understand those dynamics. So our book is full of these examples of how the power dynamics in democracies are changing as AI is introduced to them. we describe AI as a power magnifying technology. And that means for those like some of the, I think, really exciting citizens groups that I mentioned that want to use AI to amplify their power, to help make government better, AI can do that. It can magnify that interest. At the same time, for authoritarians or elected officials in democracies with authoritarian tendencies, AI can amplify their power as well. Overall, we conclude, as I'm sure most people here might as well, that AI seems to be pointing us in a direction of increasing centralization of power, but it doesn't have to be that way. We can steer in a different direction. And ultimately, those are the types of recommendations that our book builds to. I want to call out that our book is not about public data per se, but of course, data is woven into all the stories that we tell. We define AI very broadly, as maybe you can see in the examples I'm sharing. To us, it's not just ChatGPT, it's not just large language models, it's not just chatbots. It also includes predictive AI systems. It includes AI that's used for automating decision support, for risk assessment, for all the other functions in government that can be augmented or even replaced by what we might think of as statistical models or predictive machine learning, but I think increasingly we tend to use a common term, AI, to describe. And ultimately, those are models that are really based on data as opposed to direct programming by people. The common thing that they have in common is data. So clearly, I think public data will have an increasing prominence in the way that democracies operate and the interplay of those power dynamics that we're talking about. And when we try and recommend solutions, we look to examples where people are successfully navigating those power dynamics in order to prevent concentration of power and to encourage the distribution of power. One of the examples that really inspired us and that we write about in the book is the strike organized by the Writers Guild of America 2 or 3 years ago now, where they advocated not only for resistance against irresponsible uses of AI by entertainment companies that might displace the role of human labor in authoring creative materials and writing scripts, but they also advocated for them, their members, to be able to responsibly use AI. And so to us, those are 2 of 4 primary techniques that we need to organize around to steer AI in a positive direction for democracy. We need to responsibly use the technology. We should encourage government to use it where it can be beneficial, where it can make processes more efficient or more inclusive. I think machine translation is a great example of this. Machine translation is not perfect. It can make mistakes. But if it can make government dramatically more accessible to people who are not speakers of the primary language in a jurisdiction, that's a really valuable use case. I think we shouldn't accept government that is not inclusive of people speaking different languages. And if AI is a tool that can help advance that cause, we should demand it as citizens. We also talk about resistance of inappropriate use. We talk about the example of the Trump administration, which has been said they have used AI to trawl people's social media posts, to prioritize or to identify political bases for deportation, for immigration enforcement. We see that as an irresponsible use. The EFF, for example, has brought a lawsuit against the administration in response to that. I think it demonstrates the type of use case of AI in government that we should resist, that can scale up a concentration of power. But we go beyond responsible use and resistance. We recommend 2 other modes of action. And one is reform of the AI ecosystem. We, of course, talk about and would like there to be more regulation by governments around AI. Obviously, Europe is much further ahead of that than the US. But we think it should go beyond regulation, and reform of the AI ecosystem should also involve governments being more directly involved in shaping the technology of AI. And I can come back to that in just a minute to describe what that might look like. Lastly, we talk about the renovation of our democracy. There are pre-existing deficiencies in the US as well as other democracies that we've known about and been advocating for reforms for, in many cases, for decades. But those concerns become more urgent because of the power amplifying technology of AI, and the need for reform becomes more urgent. That includes, for example, campaign finance reform. If we're concerned about the increasing lobbying power of big tech and AI companies driven by the wealth and economic incentives around AI, then we have an even more urgent need for reforming our campaign finance infrastructure. If we're concerned about the pre-existing limitations of our consumer privacy regulation, data privacy regulation in the US, that concern becomes even more urgent as tech companies increasingly are finding more ways to harvest and apply consumer data with AI. But one of the core things that we advocate for, and something we think should be part of government steering of the AI ecosystem, is something we call public AI. And I think of this as a necessary counterpart to public data. If there's public data, there should be public AI. We describe public AI as a fundamentally different way of building AI than the corporate AI ecosystem that predominates today. It would provide a different basis for trust for AI systems. than AI developed under corporations that is demonstrably clearly being built for private interest. We think of public AI as a way to develop AI for public benefit instead. If you have AI being developed by public agencies as a public good under public control, it helps you make different choices in the development of AI. So for example, instead of stealing training data from content creators to train an AI system, you can choose to support a marketplace of content creators that is, equitably compensated for the use of their material. Instead of trying to chase after super intelligence and to maximize the scale at which AI models are trained, you can try and make a model that is useful, but is not chasing, incremental improvements in industry performance benchmarks, but is just good enough to use. Instead of chasing after unsustainable growth in energy usage and resource usage, you can choose to have a more sustainable development model that doesn't tax the environment or the local energy resources of a community. Instead of building AI for private profit, you can try and capture and locate the value that's created with AI in the community that's contributing to it. And ultimately, instead of having models that are accountable only to shareholders and corporate executives, you can have AI that's under public control and under public oversight. So I'll just land here on an example of what that looks like. To be frank, when we wrote the book, the examples of that kind of public AI development were very nascent. There weren't really fully featured, mature examples of what I'm describing that we could point to. But today there are. And I think that points towards the future of what AI could look like in the US and around the world. The example that we're writing about like right now comes from Switzerland, where a Swiss team has just developed a model called Apertus. This is a large-scale foundation AI model, currently is exclusively a textual large language model. In the near future, we'll have multimodal capabilities as well. It was developed by Swiss researchers at EPFL and ETH Zurich. It was developed on Swiss national supercomputing resources powered by renewable energy. It rigorously adheres to EU requirements around data compliance and opt-outs, and it doesn't use stolen training data. And it's ultimately being built as a public good, not for private profit. And it's available for anyone to use at low cost, both in Switzerland and around the world. So I'll just leave you with that thought. It's clear to me that public data is increasingly important to AI, that is increasingly important to democracy. These things are very codependent on each other, and I'm eager to talk with all of you and learn from your insights on that intersection.
That's awesome. Thank you. And for the folks that have joined us, please start thinking of your questions. You can put them in the chat, or you can, if you want a clarifying question or you want to join the conversation, just raise your hand and you can ask Nathan yourself. But I was struck in the book by the ways that you describe AI being used to strip down the administrative state, I think is one of the phrases that you guys were using, where AI has been used to remove outdated laws or clauses. And in the work that I've done with data access and data sharing agreements, so many times people point at the existing statute or regs, and it's filled with information from a bygone era. And so could you perhaps speak a little bit to those examples? Because I think it's important for people to hear not just the negative spin on AI, but to hear more examples of where it's being used for, a productive purpose.
For sure. Well, let me give you the example of the largest scale public deployment of using AI for that kind of administrative code revision that I'm aware of. But I have to warn everyone, it's not an entirely positive story, at least from my point of view, but I can at least put it out there and they can see how it can go in good and bad ways. But I'm not sure how many people are aware of this. I'd be curious if you've already heard about this, but the state of Ohio has had a project operating for 4 or 5 years now to use AI to do a full-scale revision of their administrative code. That means taking millions of words that have been assembled over generations that describe how statute in Ohio is implemented in executive rulemaking and regulation, the administrative code of Ohio. And they've been using AI to systematically go through that code and propose deletions, simplifications, removal of outdated clauses. And they claim at this point that they have removed millions of lines of code on the basis of using AI. And I think that clearly can be to the benefit of the public. Amy, as you mentioned, I think there often is outdated regulation that really does constrain public interested use cases of data as well as other activities and behaviors in society. But I have to point out that there is an intellectual or an ideological project behind that use case in Ohio that I imagine not all of us on this call would be comfortable with. I can point to that ideological use case, not out of speculation, but because the authors of that project in Ohio have been very explicit about it. The current senator from Ohio, John Husted, previously was the lieutenant governor there. He led the project of AI for administrative code revision in Ohio, and now he's introduced legislation to Congress, now that he's a senator, to do the same thing at a federal level. And he's written op-eds explaining why he's so interested in this. He's coming from an ideological point of view that is in favor of less regulation generally, not specifically targeting clauses that may, for example, inhibit public disclosure of data, but just generally trying to relieve regulatory burden as he sees it on corporations and other actors in society. And I think there are lots of good reasons not to, in general, want to relieve regulatory burden. So I'm a little bit skeptical of that ideological project. But I think this illustrates how the technology can be used in both ways. It can legitimately be used to simplify law and remove outdated clauses. It can also be used to advance an ideological project going from either side of the political spectrum.
Okay, so that was a good balanced example where it shows both the opportunity and the challenges, and also gets back to what you were saying about the concentration of power. So somebody that has an objective to do something now has these tools that can supercharge what they would have been able to do in prior decades. But I do want to poke at the other end of the spectrum and ask you what you think the biggest threat or threats are for AI that we should be thinking about?
Such an important question. And to me, there's a blaringly clear answer to that question, which is concentration of power and concentration of wealth. As I was describing earlier, it doesn't have to be the case. There's nothing about the technology that specifies this outcome. But what's happening today that we can all plainly see is that a very small number of companies, mostly in the US, mostly in Silicon Valley, are growing to a previously unimaginable scale and wealth because of their exploitation of AI. We now have the world's first trillion-dollar and now multi-trillion-dollar companies built on the back of investment in this technology. And so we have this concentration of wealth that I think poses fundamental risk to our economy in terms of putting all of our eggs in one basket, and what many people fear as an AI-powered bubble that's emerging in the economy. It presents, I think, democratic concerns. We see these companies not only investing more in lobbying, which is never a surprise when corporations do that, but also specifically tying themselves to the current Trump administration in ways that make me really uncomfortable, and creating a codependence of politics and technology development that I think is steering very clearly in one direction right now that makes me uncomfortable. So to me, it's that fundamental concentration of wealth that's the biggest choice that we face as a democracy. There's nothing about the technology that specifies it has to be built this way or profited from in this way or tied to political interests in this way. We can't steer in a different direction, and I certainly hope that we will.
But it's here and it's not going away. So now that we're thinking about how we might, as you had pointed out with the recommendations that the book makes, how we might try to steer the conversation or steer regulation about it, could you talk more to examples that a lot of the AppDo community cares about? Like, were there any examples in health or education or measuring the economy or housing or population? It could be domestic or international.
Yeah, I'd love to throw out a couple examples of, I think, really public interested use cases of AI. But if I may just push back on the idea that it's here to stay and that we can't do anything about it, I do think we can. There are opportunities for us as citizens, as organizations, to push for more federal regulation of AI, to steer the AI ecosystem through public AI development. And by the way, to have antitrust action and to prevent the concentration of power in monopolistic companies in a way that maybe does seem unimaginable today, but a few years ago, under the actions of Lena Khan, maybe didn't seem so unimaginable. And with all of our input to our political system, I don't think has to be impossible in the future. But to build on your question and give a couple of examples of public interested use cases, maybe I can start with one that comes from Brazil. There's an example of citizens using AI to drive public oversight. There's a project called Operation Love Serenade in Brazil, driven by, I think it's called the Democratic Knowledge Project in Brazil. And it was named after a chocolate brand, Love Serenade, in Brazil. And the reason this project was named that way is that it had been uncovered years and years ago in a scandal that a Brazilian public official was spending large amounts of public money on luxuries, things that were not for the public benefit. And so a team of technologists, a volunteer civic technology team, set out to try and identify, are there other examples of that happening in government? And about a decade ago now, they built an AI-powered tool called Rosie that automatically trawls public expense reports on an automated basis and sends out a tweet for everyone to see if they find something that is suspicious. And that has led to hundreds of investigations of public officials of cases that seem to be legitimate cases of inappropriate expenditure or even corruption. And that project has now gone on to go beyond that first application and to find other ways to leverage the technology and leverage public data to provide watchdogging and accountability for government. I'll give you one more example that's a little bit more government efficiency oriented and it's a little bit more environmentally oriented. There's a project that we write about that actually is coming from China, not one of the democracies that we primarily write about in the book, but I think a good example for democracies to learn from, where a research group has demonstrated the use of machine learning technologies to prioritize industrial sites for inspection. This is one of the problems that we pervasively face in every democracy where we have good environmental regulations. We generally don't spend enough on public servants to go out to every facility every year or every period to physically inspect them. We have to prioritize those numbers of inspectors that we hire to go on site and see the ground truth. And we can do that in a more efficient way to optimize for outcomes like maximizing enforcement against the worst actors. Of course, you can make a different policy choice here. There's nothing about the technology itself that specifies that the outcome will be in the public interest. You might also, write that algorithm and use the machine learning system to maybe, protect certain friendly industries or to prioritize enforcement over political adversaries. So I want to emphasize again that these technologies are applied by humans who often are carrying their own interests. But I think this project demonstrates that you can improve efficiency and you can seek a given outcome that there should be public oversight over which outcome is chosen, that can make that kind of an inspection and environmental enforcement process more efficient.
Yeah. AppDo is on deck to release our guiding principles, one of which is transparency. So to what you were just saying, how could we, I know that we would need to band together to get that sort of transparency, but where does that information live so that everybody can so that it is accessible to everybody to understand how these systems are being developed and used and monitored or modified?
Oh, it's a great question. Of course, I hesitate to recommend to AppDo. I know everyone on this call has probably thought much more deeply about transparency requirements for government public data than I have. But just to call out some of the specific intersections with AI that enable the kinds of public interested applications that we write about in the book, I think clearly it's valuable to have data that's published in a machine readable format. I think part of transparency is not only accessibility, not only open access, but also the ability to usefully use that data in a format that supports a given application. 4 or 5 years ago, it would have been very difficult to take, for example, a bunch of environmental permits that were published in PDF format. This is a example I have an uncomfortable amount of experience with. It's very difficult to take those PDF formatted documents and make them available for downstream analysis or for oversight. Today, I think that's actually, of course, a lot easier because AI has been a very useful technology for data coding and structured data extraction from less structured or unstructured formats. So arguably, that's maybe a little bit less important now than it was in the past. On the other hand, I think there's so many more organizations now that have the capability to do data science, to drive automated systems of oversight and public communication from those data sets, that there's a greater impact that can be achieved if you make that easy for organizations to do, if you provide the data not only openly, but in an accessible format, in a machine readable format.
Thanks. We have a question in the chat here. Nathan, I'll give you a second to look it over, but the core question is, how much influence will state governments have to create legislation around the development and the modeling of these tools? And then how can they support training people to review the outputs to be aware of the way things are drifting?
A great question. First of all, from my point of view, that framework of 4 actions that we as a society need to take to respond to the risks of democracy and AI, they apply as much at the state level as they do at the federal level. So the idea of responsible use of AI in government, I think, applies at the state level. Resisting inappropriate uses of AI, reforming the AI ecosystem, and renovating our democracy, all of that is relevant at the state level as well. Of course, I imagine just about everyone on this call is aware of the dynamic between the states and the federal government right now in very recent weeks, where the Trump administration has tried to unilaterally enact a ban on state governments regulating the AI industry. It was previously proposed to put this in in congressional statute that did not succeed. And so the Trump administration has tried to issue an executive order to enforce that ban. There are lots of questions about how much teeth are in the actions that are proposed in the executive order. I think most states that have AI regulations on the books are not too worried that it's really an enforceable ban on the part of the federal government. But to me, it's very concerning that that is the posture being taken by the federal government. Right now, it's really, states are really the only game in town in the US to apply meaningful regulation over the AI ecosystem. We've got some states like California that are a little further along in that, maybe a little bit less aggressive than I or others might like, but further along than other states. And virtually every state with pending legislation under consideration to apply regulation to AI. So to me, it would be disastrous to eliminate the only potential source of regulation that seems foreseeable in at least the next 2 or 3 years in the US. And in addition, I think one of the traditional strengths of our federal system is that the states are the laboratories of democracy. The idea that we can innovate and test different approaches to not only regulate the AI ecosystem, but again, to demonstrate responsible use in government, to demonstrate restriction on AI use in different contexts, and to learn from that, and to help us advance that kind of differentiation in federal policy as well. I guess the last point I want to make about state regulation is that a lot of the opposition, and I think the Trump administration's stated reasoning for this ban, is the idea that it's too complex for AI companies to adhere to different regulations in different jurisdictions. And my point of view on that is that, sorry, too bad. You're the biggest companies in the world. You can comply with different rules in different places. You already do it under for lots of different purposes. I don't see why it's impossible for them to do the same thing for regulations that specifically concern AI development. So I really dismiss that particular argument.
Okay, the other part of the question is when you're in state government, how do you get the workforce kitted up to observe the outputs or even to avail themselves of the tools? Because, there are good ways to use the data, but then you're also getting these outputs that people are skeptical of. So what are the right or opportunities for training for people to review it?
A great question. I think it's the right question too, because I think implicit in that question is acknowledging that the particular risks and particular benefits of AI are very case dependent. A given model will have much greater or lower levels of success for different tasks. And a given model will have different levels of effectiveness or also making mistakes or introducing potential harms depending on how it is used, how it's prompted, how it's instructed, what context is managed for it, how it's embedded in larger systems and processes. So to me, I think there's no simple solution to that. For better or worse, it probably involves several things that are necessary to responsibly use AI in those public contexts. One is public disclosure and comment. We point to Canada as a great example for how to do this. Canada issued a directive on automated decision making for the Canadian federal government years ago, I think even before the release of ChatGPT, for example, giving agencies specific guidance that they have to disclose use cases of AI in decision making that affects people, specifying a channel for public comment, and then specifying how they need to respond to that. So there are requirements around transparency and accepting public input, and mitigating risk that I think is a really good practice for other governments to follow. Canada's not the only example of that, but I think is one of the pioneering ones, and one that they now have many dozens of published examples on the Canadian government's website showing what that kind of public interaction looks like to adjudicate these kind of AI use cases. In addition to that disclosure and public comment, I think another technique is trying to partner with civic organizations, with technologists that can add expertise to the public sector. I think there are so many great examples of this happening across the country. I'm not sure if I mentioned earlier, but our project Maple, the Massachusetts Platform for Legislative Engagement, is being built with volunteer technologists, including myself, organized through Code for Boston, which was founded as a brigade of Code for America years and years ago. That's just one example of an organization that is trying to put together folks with technical expertise who are explicitly coming together to volunteer their time with public agencies to help them build things, to help advise them and give them guidance on technology adoption. I don't think we should, require or expect that agencies have to do it all themselves, all on their own, or that people who are not currently technology experts have to somehow become technology experts. I hope we can leverage those kinds of public interested partnerships to help iterate and figure out the best way to apply the technology.
So the public interest tech and civic tech groups can help with kind of the movement, but the newest question in the Q&A is about citizens wanting to be able to use AI, but they themselves lack the skills and the compute power. So how would you encourage putting AI into the hands of the average person?
A great question. To me, this is a question that really ties to the previous one because so much of it about it is just about empowering people with the knowledge of how to use current AI tools. I'm sure a lot of folks who have joined us have experience using vibe coding or rapid prototyping tools that make it really easy, just in natural language, to instruct an AI model to build what could be a civic technology project or to otherwise apply the power of AI to a task at hand. I think the products around it, even the commercial services around those types of capabilities have come so far that they probably are accessible to most people, but it definitely, does require some knowledge that they exist and some knowledge to get started in using them and to understand their limitations and failure modes as well. In terms of access to compute, I think we are maybe in a precarious position where today there's a lot of venture funded investment that is supporting the freely available use of the most powerful AI models in the world that have cost companies perhaps billions of dollars to build and are being made available for free for people to use at a pretty significant scale. I don't know that that's always going to be the case. I think we can expect the same thing to happen with AI that has happened to other platforms. This is the so-called platform decay cycle, where eventually the chickens come home to roost. The investors want their money back, and uh, free access to those kinds of powerful technologies decreases over time. To me, the need to provide those powerful technologies in a way that is accessible to people and not at exorbitant cost on an ongoing basis is one of the reasons to support that kind of vision of public AI that is built for public interest and not to capture profit for purely private interests.
I'm thinking back to your Brazil example because everything that you've just been discussing is people presumably wanting to use AI to make their lives and tasks more efficient or better, learn new things, things like that. But when you were saying that the potentially improper expense account things would then get blasted out, I could imagine how that could be like overwhelmed by bots or lookalikes, deep fakes, things like that. Uh, can you talk a little bit about the people that are organizing this? Like, it used to be someone would have to go in and Photoshop something, but now you can generate a gazillion different versions and have it a video, like the way that it could be used in kind of those darker modes. Do you run across examples of that?
Oh, for sure. And of course, so much of the public debate about AI today is about its impacts on the information ecosystem, and rightly so. You just gave the right litany, automated disinformation, automated propagation of propaganda, personalization of propaganda to individuals. I think those are all real risks. Of course, the existence of misinformation, the existence of manipulated imagery and data, the existence of propaganda, all of that obviously precedes AI by many centuries. But AI, as it does with many things, can amplify the speed and the scale and the scope and the sophistication of how that misinformation can be generated and propagated. Those are very real risks. To me, it just emphasizes the importance of trust and networks of organizations in both civil society and government. Let's start at the source in terms of the public data disclosure from the Treasury or whichever agency is responsible for providing those expense disclosure reports. That data could be flawed. They could not report expenses that could get somebody in trouble, that represent corruption. There has to be civic trust and mechanisms of accountability and oversight baked into the democratic process for that agency to trust the data at the source. Then at the next step, you have an organization, in this case, a civil society group, a nonprofit project that is processing that data and choosing to share it. And there has to be trust in that organization as well, because as you say, they could manipulate that data, they could selectively share it, they could misrepresent it. And there's at least a third level here, which is the platform. When they built this project years ago, this Rosie bot, they were using Twitter as their distribution mechanism. I don't know that a similarly situated group would use Twitter as a distribution mechanism today for reasons that we can all understand. The platform has a role too in selecting and shaping what information is shared widely, who gets to see it, and what access a group like that has to the platform. So ultimately, the same, I think, networks of trust that existed before AI still exist today. You have to trust, you have to have mechanisms of accountability and oversight for the public agencies. You have to trust the civic agencies. You have to trust the communication platforms. I think AI does exacerbate the risk of misinformation, but ultimately we have to fall back on it. We have to strengthen the core networks of trust that have always enabled us to believe what we see.
One of the things that I noted in the book is that you guys said that AI was likely to have a positive impact when an existing system is bottlenecked by speed, scale, scope, and sophistication. And I thought that that was such a tidy little summary that all of us could think about because I think we're often looking at things where it's one or more of those problems. Could you speak a bit to how you guys came to that, that summary?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you found that to be a useful framework. For us, it really came from thinking through lots of use cases of trying to ask ourselves, is AI an appropriate tool to use here? Is it really beneficial, or is it just being used to hype the application, or is it really just ancillary to solving the problem? To explain why we landed on speed, scale, scope, and sophistication, I would start by pointing out what is not part of that framework. We don't see, for example, being better, generically better, or having superior performance as a key reason to use AI. We do not see being more objective as a key reason to use AI. I generally don't think it is. In fact, often I think when people point to an AI tool or to any kind of computerized system and say, you should believe it because it's more objective than a human would be, I see that as tech washing. It's a way to kind of defer blame, defer decision-making authority to say, I'm not responsible for that. Trust me because the computer says it. But instead, I think AI has legitimate benefits, durable benefits over individual humans, certainly when it comes to speed, scale, scope, and sophistication. We analyze that in terms of AI's ability to make decisions faster. Again, not necessarily better, but faster than humans. We give the example of human artists are actually great at generating super resolution images. If you give an excellent artist enough time, they can take a kind of a blurry image from your cell phone or something and make it into a beautiful hyper-realistic representation. But it takes a really long time to do that. AI turns out to be able to do something similar much, much faster. Likewise, scale. AI can operate in many places at once, where all of us as humans can operate in just one place at once, and it can be expensive and hard to coordinate many of us to operate at scale. In terms of scope, each of us tries to cultivate expertise, usually in a few different areas, maybe the most advanced of us in several areas, but definitely not in everything. AI models are not perfect. They're not superior to human experts necessarily in any area, but they can be broadly applicable to have scope across many, many different domains of expertise. And then lastly, sophistication, the idea that as humans, we can consider a certain number of facts, a certain number of resources, pieces of information when we make a decision. An AI model may not be superior in making a decision, but it can demonstrably take into account much, much more information at the same time than we can. So those are the key bottlenecks that we see and problems that are really governed by one of those issues. We think AI is appropriate to apply and with effort can provide a real benefit there. But for those other areas like objectivity or superiority, I don't think AI has special advantages.
I was also struck in the book by the times where you guys said that the question shouldn't be, is AI perfect? It should be, is AI as good as the alternatives or better than the alternatives?
I think that's exactly right. We ask again and again throughout the book, compared to what? And we talked earlier about, to me, a good example of this, which is machine translation. Machine translation is flawed. It can be biased. It can be, based on models that systematically represent certain points of view more in their outputs or that hallucinate, make mistakes. All of those are very real imperfections of AI models. By the way, we humans have some of those imperfections as well. We humans tend to be, trained on a certain context and not be able to represent every area of lived experience equally. We also make mistakes sometimes. When we're talking a language that's not our primary language, we may even be more likely to make those kinds of mistakes. But AI does have a real advantage there of speed and scale. I can use an AI system to translate not just one hearing in a legislature, but every hearing that's ever happened in the legislature very quickly. I can use it to not just help, let's say, for example, a service provider at a registry of motor vehicles to help them interact with someone who's not primarily an English speaker here in the US, let's say, in one place, but I can help every single driver who comes into that registry to converse in their preferred language all at the same time. I think those are good examples of where it's appropriate to use AI because the alternative is to not include everybody on the basis of their language. And to me, that is an unacceptable outcome.
All right, I've been asking lots of questions. Anyone in our audience have any other questions or topics that you'd like to hear Nathan speak to? Again, you can raise your hand or you could pop it in the chat. All right, well, I'm going to ask you another question while we're seeing if others have any. What haven't I asked you about that you think our participants should
Hmm.
really know?
Oh, great question. Um, we've touched on a lot of the examples that are really motivating for us in the book. We've talked about some of the key frameworks that we talk about. Maybe I would just mention kind of for color where we start in the book. We really identify AI as not a fundamentally different challenge for democracy, but rather as part of a continuum of technology advancements that is just one in the next line of advancements that change how democracy works. So we say AI is reshaping democracy, but we think every generation of technology has substantially reshaped democracy. And this is not a history book. We don't go into great depth on those examples, but we start with, we think, a compelling example from ancient Greece and how the Greeks developed voting systems. The Greeks innovated, sort of Stone Age or Bronze Age technologies to allow people to vote, to allow for randomized selection of Greek citizens to participate in government, to serve in roles of public office. Forgive my Greek pronunciation, but they developed a system of using stone stelae called kleroteria, that allowed them to not only randomly select someone based on, effectively dropping a ball in a box, but actually have a sort of a doubled up system that increases the randomness of that process beyond just having a box or a single stele. They really innovated in the use of technology and even tried to solve some statistical problems to encode the way they wanted to make their democracy works, which is random selection, random allotment, through technology. AI is, of course, a very different way of doing that than stone technologies, but I do think it's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum of a long continuity of those types of changes. And of course, we can think of social media, we can think of the internet, we can think of radio, television, the railroad as all part of that journey. And I hope we'll make some good decisions together, as citizens of democracies, about how to adjust and adapt our democracy to deal with the risks and benefits of AI.
I love that example. When I read it, I was like, God, there's so much I don't know. So there were plenty of interesting little stories like that that make it all seem so relevant right now. We got another question. What would be your advice to college students today of majors or experience they should be pursuing to meet this new challenge and the needs for public AI?
Oh, I love that question so much. You know, to me, some of the lessons that we've talked about point to the importance of interdisciplinarity. Um, I think to be a civic technologist, to apply technology in the public interest in the past, required really focusing on developing some specialized technical skills in data science and statistics and computer science and programming. And I think those skills are all still very valuable. I have no question about that. I spent a lot of my own career specializing in those skills. I don't regret that. But I do think that with the assistance of AI technologies, with some of the AI assisted coding tools that we talked about earlier, those skills are, they're a little bit less specialized to develop. They require less intensive investment to develop, I think, than was true in the past. And for a student, I hope that's a good thing, because if you're interested in these intersections of technology and governance, technology and democracy, technology and science, technology and politics, you can have a broader training. You can cultivate experience. You can take courses in those other disciplines alongside, I hope, some technology and science courses. And then you can really specialize in those intersections instead of having to spend all of your time focusing on just one or the other side of the fence.
That's great. Thanks. It wasn't like there is nothing to do. You will be working for a robot overlords. That was like a really optimistic answer there. Another in the QA, who are you following, reading, or learning from about AI tech innovations, how we think about AI, etc.? Who's doing good work in the space beside you? I love that question too.
Oh, I love it too. Of course, lots and lots of people doing great work. I would be remiss if I didn't start with my co-author, Bruce Schneier, who's been writing not only about AI, not only about cybersecurity, but specifically about public interest technology for decades. And his work really has inspired me, and I've been thrilled to work with him. So he's at Schneier.com, and he's a very prolific writer and blogger on these subjects. Let me also call out a technology blogger that he and I both really admire, which is Simon Wilson, who is a developer of open source technologies like Dataset that are focused on helping people use and analyze data, including in public contexts. And he's been really at the kind of tip of the spear of inspecting, evaluating, adopting a lot of new AI-oriented coding technologies and using AI in product development. And I really value his perspective on those tools as they come out. And then one other platform, blogging platform I'll call out is AndrewGelman.com. Andrew Gelman is a very noted Bayesian statistician. He's one of my professors when I was when I was doing my training. And not only he blogs at that website, but also lots of other statisticians and that he collaborates with, including Bob Carpenter, for example. And they have lots of interesting things to say about not only statistics, but also the use of public data sets and, for example, interpretation of census data, the misuse of data and when scientific fraud is committed with that data, and also how AI is influencing the practice of statistics, where it's really useful, also where it can be misleading or unhelpful.
Okay, speaking of, there was a tweet that came out pretty recently about a political scientist who took an earlier paper that he had published and he pointed AI at it and through probably very sophisticated prompts, but had it seek the updated data and reproduce the paper with the newer vintages. What are your thoughts on the way that AI is going to change the evidence base and the way that research happens?
Yes, it was making me think actually on one of the blogs I just mentioned. There was a post just today about the NeurIPS conference, one of the big AI conferences, and they had a public statement recently about the identification of some hallucinated citations in NeurIPS submissions that suggests that researchers submitting to that conference are actively using AI and apparently in some cases not bothering to check or not sufficiently checking the references that come out. So what does that mean about the reliability of research in this field? To me, clearly, AI can be a very helpful research tool, not only in kind of the quantitative practice of science and statistics, actively using it for purposes like chemical representation learning or protein structure prediction. The Nobel Prize that was awarded last year to the AlphaFold team. I think clearly AI can be used very responsibly and very effectively for those applications, but also just as an assistive tool for researchers to think through and write about and digest the literature and even advance their own sort of research findings and presentation around a data set and a problem. I do think it can be very useful. I think it would be counterproductive to restrict researchers from accessing those tools. But examples like the one I just gave with NeurIPS, first of all, clearly emphasize the responsibility that a human author ultimately has to own all the interpretation, own the decision making, own the write up, the presentation of the results and the citations around that. AI does not absolve them of that responsibility, even if it is a really useful tool. Then I also think it calls out some of the processes that we need to put in place to help even researchers that are intending to do good, who are not motivated in some improper way to use the tools responsibly. I think first of all, just mitigating some of the inherent problems that we're talking about around hallucination is important, but also giving researchers tools that help them specifically apply these capabilities in research contexts in a responsible way, tools that help them assess the outputs of models when they're using them to perform analysis, helping them do things as simple as just fact-checking citations or constraining models to be grounded authentically in literature and not to be capable of making up citations are very important. I think we're just at the beginning of making those kinds of ecosystems of tools.
Thanks. I think there's a question that kind of bridges off the conversation that we were just having. Specifically for the public sector, what problems do you see AI solve that cannot be solved by conventional research designs?
Conventional research designs. Well, in answering that question, I think back to that framework we talked about a moment ago: speed, scale, scope, and sophistication. I think when one of those facets is the bottleneck, that's where AI can really make a difference in work in the public interest. We've given the example of machine translation. Let me build on another example, which is synthesizing public input and authentically being responsive to public comment in legislative or rulemaking processes. I think, a sort of historical flaw of our democracy is that as our populations grow, as we have more people, as we have fewer legislators representing larger districts, more speech, more people trying to get involved in the process actually results in less listening. It becomes less possible over time for those representatives to authentically hear and respond to a larger number of people. I think technology and AI in particular can legitimately be a helpful part of that process. It can help facilitate discussions at a larger scale. There are great examples of that happening around the world. We have some colleagues at Make.org, a French organization, that are organizing large-scale civic assemblies at a scale of hundreds of thousands of people that you could not possibly fit physically into a room or facilitate using conventional technologies, but they're using digital platforms and AI to allow those citizens to understand what others have already said and then to have their voice heard on issues like, for example, one of the largest assemblies they've run was about the issue of assisted death in France and across Europe. So I think that's an example where the scalability and the speed of humans to analyze and understand what a large group of people are saying is the bottleneck. And AI can be useful in that. And there are real risks as well, access to technology, people who are less and more familiar with digital platforms, going online, may have less access, and that creates real issues. We have those issues today as well. Here in Massachusetts, historically, if you can't drive to Boston and take a day off work, you haven't had access to the legislative process. So I think those are the kinds of pros and cons, and compared to what questions that are pertinent in identifying where AI can be used responsibly. But ultimately, when there's a bottleneck of speed, scale, scope, and sophistication, I think that's where it's pertinent to make a difference.
That's great. Thank you. Nathan, I want to thank you for being with us today. I've really enjoyed our conversation. And for anybody that wants to go back and rewatch this or share with colleagues, we will be posting a recording to Aptu's YouTube channel. And if you'd like to see more events like this, please let us know by sending an email to info@aptu.org. That's going to be in the chat. And please keep in touch with us. Check out our monthly newsletter and also check out Rewiring Democracy. It is filled with these examples that both will unnerve you and hopefully give you hope for the future. But I hope everybody has appreciated this. And Nathan, thanks for taking the time to talk to us.
My great pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everyone who joined.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining us today.